Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. March 1904, 16,000 feet above sea level on the Tibetan plateau, two armies fought a deadly battle. One was the British Indian Army, including Gurkhas and Sikhs, armed with the latest modern weapons. The other, an army of Tibetan warriors armed with medieval weapons and sacred charms. This is the extraordinary story of the Younghusband Expedition, Britain's most remote military campaign. What began as a paranoid response to fears of the Russians taking control of this mysterious land on India's borders became a 1,200-mile march across the roof of the world, culminating in battles at record-breaking altitudes that wouldn't be surpassed for 80 years. But when the British Army finally entered the forbidden city of Lhasa, would they find the Russian threat was real? Or had the Empire fought a war based on phantom fears? This is the story of Britain's forgotten war on the roof of the world. The British invasion of Tibet, normally referred to as the Younghusband Expedition, was a response to fears that the Russians were intending to seize control of the vast and mysterious land of Tibet to the north of British India. In many ways, it was the finale to the great game which Britain and Russia had played out in Central Asia through the 19th century, and which I've talked about in previous episodes. Tibet was an ancient Buddhist country to the north of India across the Himalayas. It was a remote and mysterious country which few Westerners had ever visited. Nominally under the control of China, but ruled by the 13th Dalai Lama since 1878, and under his rule he had started to reassert Tibetan autonomy from the weak Chinese imperial regime. All of which didn't particularly interest the British. Apart from some minor border infringements, mainly by Tibetan yak herders, the mysterious land was of no great value, as long as it didn't threaten India itself. But towards the end of the 19th century, that started to change. Rumours started to circulate that at least one, if not more, Buddhist monks from eastern Russia were acting as intermediaries between the Tsar, Nicholas II, and the ruler of Tibet, the Dalai Lama. It seemed that the Russians were trying to pull Tibet into their sphere of influence. Some rumours even suggested that the Tsar had given some sort of assurance that the Russians would come to the Tibetans' aid if ever the British invaded. Now, how serious this promise was, if indeed it was ever made, is hard to ascertain. Seeing as the British had never even postured on Tibet's borders, it was possibly a promise made in the firm knowledge that it would never have to be cashed in. Because when the British did come calling, the Russians, apart from protesting, made no attempt to send troops into Tibet. And anyway, when that moment happened, they had bigger fish to fry. But that was in the future. In 1903, the British Viceroy in India, Lord Curzon, started to hear even more alarming rumours. That the Russians were smuggling modern rifles into the country to arm the Tibetans for a potential invasion of India with or without direct Russian military support, or at least to destabilise the border regions of the British-ruled subcontinent. These rumours fed the persistent British fears that the Russian Empire's rapid advance through Central Asia during the 19th century would only end when they seized India. And no one was a bigger believer in this Russian grand strategy than the Viceroy, Lord Curzon. Appointed in 1899 when he was just 39 years old, Curzon had always been anti-Russian and favoured a forward policy to protect British control of India. He protested about the rumoured Russian presence in Tibet to the Chinese, the nominal rulers, who admitted they had little control. But when he protested to the Tibetans, they said the British would have to go through Beijing. And round Curzon went. In fact, many of his letters to the Dalai Lama were returned unopened. What with the Russians openly talking about their own excellent relations with the Tibetan leader, thanks to those monks come spies, the alarm bells in Curzon's head were jangling madly that the secretive Buddhist land was about to fall into the Russian orbit, and that in turn would bring the Russians to India's northern border. Curzon decided to send a British military mission to Tibet to negotiate directly with the Dalai Lama and secure the appointment of a British agent in the capital, Lhasa. Of course, his hidden agenda was to hunt out those Russian spies as well as those smuggled Russian rifles. The British government, however, were not convinced about another armed intervention. The recent Boer War in South Africa had exposed Britain's isolation on the world stage, a stage on which the bellicose Kaiser of Germany was taking, or certainly was perceived to be taking, a decidedly anti-British stance. Russia, the bogeyman of Central Asia and threat to British India, was starting to be seen as a possible balance to Germany. So the last thing the British Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, wanted was to antagonise the Russians by openly expanding British control in Tibet. Basically, while Curzon saw Tibet as the picture, Balfour saw it merely as part of a much bigger picture. Thus London authorised Curzon to merely conduct a diplomatic mission to Tibet, to settle a series of minor border infringements involving those herdsmen and their yaks. Frustrated but checked, Curzon appointed Major Francis Younghusband to lead the mission. Born in 1863 in India, Younghusband's name is almost synonymous with the Great Game. He had travelled extensively in the Hindu Kush, the Pamirs, the Karakorams and the Himalayan mountain ranges, exploring remote communities, mapping regions for the first time, and running into Russian agents, doing exactly the same for their own country. His explorations would lead to him being elected, at the time, the youngest ever member of the Royal Geographical Society. A military officer, explorer, newspaper correspondent, and student of Asian religions, he really is a fascinating character, worthy of an episode in his own right. Drop me a comment if you'd like me to tell a story about him. To give him suitable credibility when dealing with the Tibetans and the Chinese, Younghusband was promoted to the rank of colonel, and on the 19th of July 1903 he crossed into Tibet. Accompanied by 3 other diplomats, he ignored Tibetan requests to leave and instead headed for the monastery fortress at Kambagyong. The mission now descended into a farce. The Tibetans refused to have anything to do with his mission and retreated into their fortress. Meanwhile, the Chinese representative accompanying Younghusband stated that he could do little without Tibetan cooperation. Autumn 1903, and with the Tibetans refusing to even talk, and the rumours of Russian rifles refusing to go away, the British government reluctantly agreed that a stronger action would be needed to bring the Tibetans to the negotiating table. They authorised Younghusband to travel closer to the capital. Realising that this tiny diplomatic mission would probably not cut much ice, they also authorised Curzon to send a 1,200-strong military force to accompany him. However, Curzon was also informed that this force was a negotiating tactic, and only to be used if Younghusband was attacked. Furthermore, it was not to be used as an army of occupation, and under no circumstances was Tibet to be absorbed into the British Empire. The vast majority of this British army was actually made up of contingents from the British Indian Army, including the 8th Gurkhas, the 40th Pathans, the 23rd and 32nd Sikh Pioneers, and the 19th Punjab Infantry. They were accompanied by 4 artillery pieces and 2 Maxim machine guns. Whilst Younghusband was in charge of the expedition, and it was known as the Younghusband Expedition, military command was actually held by Brigadier General James MacDonald. The 42-year-old was a son of an army surgeon and had been born whilst his father was serving in India. Commissioned as an engineer officer, he had participated in the Fashoda Expedition, the Boer War and the Boxer Rising, and following a stint as chief engineer of the British East Africa Railway, had, rather like Younghusband, been made a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Led by a sepoy carrying the Union flag, they crossed the passes into Tibet in December 1903. Apart from 1,200 troops, the column also consisted of 10,000 camp followers. 7,000 mules and 4,000 yaks were needed to carry all the force's supplies through the harsh, desolate Tibetan landscape. Their goal was Gyantse, about halfway between the border and the Tibetan capital of Lhasa. Struggling through the Himalayan winter, later that month they reached the Jalap Pass, standing at 14,000 feet above sea level, and entrance to the Tibetan Plateau, the roof of the world. The conditions were bitterly harsh. Rifle bolts froze into the breeches. Officers kept the Maxim machine gun bolts warm by sleeping with them, and soldiers were forced to write letters home in pencil because the ink froze. And whilst the troops' clothing was lavish by the standards of the day, they didn't really offer any real protection against the cold, and they were far too bulky to fight in. But fortunately for them, the Tibetans made no attempt to attack the column. As the winter gave way to spring, Younghusband and MacDonald began their advance in earnest, and by the end of March had reached the pass at Guru. By now, the immediate fear of a Russian takeover of Tibet had been overshadowed by their own problems further east. Growing tensions with Japan had come to a head on the 8th of January, when the Japanese had, without warning, attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. The news reached Younghusband as he arrived at Guru. It was at Guru, also known as Chomikshenko, that the British found a Tibetan army of 2,000 blocking the road leading towards the capital, Lhasa. Included in their number were a group of warrior monks who travelled from Lhasa with orders to halt the British expedition. Whilst outnumbering the British force 2-1, the Tibetans were hopelessly outmatched. Their army was more like a medieval army than one a decade away from the First World War. The most modern weapons they had were matchlock muskets. Despite the arrival of the warrior monks, most of their army consisted of peasants pressed into service, and armed with swords or bows and arrows. Many carried sacred charms to ward off the bullets of Maxim machine guns. Interestingly, there was no appearance of the Russian weapons that had supposedly been smuggled into the country. On the other hand, most of the British Indian troops were armed with bolt-action, 10-round magazine-fed Lee Enfield rifles, firing .303 cartridges, although some were still using older Lee Metfords. Also present were their Maxim machine guns. Younghusband informed the Tibetan general that his men would be disarmed if they didn't stand aside in 15 minutes. When his ultimatum time passed, MacDonald ordered his troops to advance towards the Tibetans. Scuffles broke out as sepoys struggled to disarm the Tibetans, and suddenly the Tibetan general drew a revolver from beneath his robes and fired at one of the Sikh soldiers, blowing his jaw off. The Tibetans took this as a signal to attack and rushed towards the Indian troops. However, the Gurkhas and Sikhs were well trained and disciplined, and promptly unleashed a murderous fire, both with their rifles and their accompanying machine guns. The Battle of Guru on the 31st of March 1904 is often known as the Massacre at Chomikshenko, and massacre is possibly a better description based upon the one-sided casualty figures. Within a matter of minutes, somewhere around 700 Tibetans lay dead or dying on the field. Hopelessly outgunned, the Tibetans retreated, but not a headlong rush for safety, but a casual walk. MacDonald continued to allow his men to shoot as the Tibetans continued this leisurely, slightly bizarre and equally slightly dignified retreat. Younghusband was one of many officers who later wrote at their sorrow and even disgust at the one-sided slaughter. One officer, Lieutenant Arthur Haddo, even claimed that despite MacDonald's order to bag as many Tibetans as possible, he had stopped firing his Maxim because he felt sick. 200 wounded Tibetans were treated in hastily assembled British medical tents. Younghusband's force had suffered just 6 casualties. When news of the battle or massacre reached London, many were outraged. On the back of the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, a small but growing number of voices were raising concerns about the morality of empire. Meanwhile, far away on the Tibetan plateau, the expedition continued towards Gyantse, the halfway point to Lhasa. However, they were now facing increasingly bitter resistance along the route, but all with the same results. The next obstacle in early April was the Red Idol Gorge. The Gurkha attack up the steep sides of the gorge was conducted in a snow blizzard. Despite all that nature could throw at them, the Gurkhas managed to scale the heights and now found themselves above the Tibetan defenders. And once more, the Tibetans came under sustained modern rifle fire. 200 of their number were killed. Then the Tibetans gathered an army to make a stand at the 16,000-foot Karo Pass. The Battle of Karo Lo was fought at between 16,000 and 18,700 feet, or 5,700 metres. That is just short of the height of North America's highest mountain, Mount McKinley, or 2/3 of the height of Everest. A battle fought as much against the elements of sheer rock faces, the cold and altitude sickness, as much as against an enemy. And all in an age where there were no supplies of oxygen. The Battle of Karo Lo held the record as the highest altitude battle ever fought until an Indo-Pakistani clash in the 1980s. The British force, consisting of the 8th Gurkhas and the 32nd Sikh Pioneers, lost 5 men killed and 13 wounded. The Tibetans, however, lost over 400 men. Now, whilst both units were commanded by British officers, they were from the British Indian Army. The 32nd Pioneers were disbanded in the 1920s, and the 8th Gurkhas were one of the Gurkha regiments transferred to the Indian Army upon independence. So despite those officers, it would be pushing it to suggest that this action, which held the altitude record for 80 years, was a British record. The expedition finally reached Gyantse, with its citadel perched on a high outcrop above the town. And once more, just like the previous year, Younghusband settled down and waited for the Tibetans and the Chinese to send negotiating teams. And he waited and waited. With nothing much going on, MacDonald now withdrew part of his force to secure his lines of communications. The Tibetans, based in the fortress monastery above the town, seized the opportunity and attacked Younghusband's depleted garrison. Once more, however, Tibetan bravery was no match for modern industrial warfare. 160 Tibetans were killed in the assault, for just 3 of Younghusband's men. Whilst beaten off, the Tibetan attack and continued presence in their fortress had rattled the British authorities. There was every chance that Younghusband and his small force could be cut off in the middle of Tibet, either requiring a major rescue effort or worse. This Tibetan mission could rapidly turn into either a military or PR disaster, or both. The 1st Battalions of both the Royal Fusiliers and the Royal Irish Rifles, along with an Indian regiment, were ordered to advance with all speed from India to bolster the expedition to nearly 3,000 men. It was also becoming apparent to Curzon in India, as well as the government in London, that the Tibetans were not going to negotiate. To turn the screw further, it was decided that the expedition, when suitably reinforced, should march all the way to Lhasa itself. But before they could do that, the citadel above Gyantse, the Gyantse Dzong, would have to be taken out. By now, Brigadier General MacDonald had arrived back on the scene, with very clear orders from the Commander-in-Chief India, Lord Kitchener, that he, not Younghusband, was to be in charge of military operations. The attack on the fortress began before dawn on the 6th of July 1904. The walls of the fortress proved much thicker than anticipated, but eventually the outer walls were breached by concentrated artillery fire, to which the Tibetans had no response. A storming party, led by Lieutenant John Grant and Havildar Kabir Pun from the 8th Gurkhas, crept forward, but were spotted by Tibetan defenders, who proceeded to roll large boulders down on them. They had almost reached the breach when both men were hit by one of those boulders and fell 30 feet back down the rock face. Despite serious injuries, both men got to their feet and once more led the Gurkhas forward, with the Havildar shooting a defender as they broke into the fortress. With reinforcements arriving, the fighting continued into the afternoon, when finally the defenders escaped the citadel using a series of secret passageways. Once more, despite the impressive defences, it had been a one-sided battle. 300 Tibetans had been killed or wounded, whilst Younghusband's expedition had lost 4 men dead and a further 30 wounded. For his bravery, Lieutenant Grant was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only one ever awarded for actions on Tibetan soil. Grant would go on to serve on the Western Front and in Mesopotamia during the First World War, and after that in the Third Anglo-Afghan War. He retired with the rank of colonel and died in Tunbridge Wells in 1968 at the grand old age of 89. Havildar Kabir Pun was awarded the Indian Order of Merit, First Class. It was the highest honour a native Indian soldier could receive, until the Victoria Cross was extended to Indian soldiers in 1911. By now, the Tibetans lost any hope of defeating the British. The Dalai Lama fled to Mongolia, leaving the inevitable peace negotiations to his subordinates. On the 2nd of August 1904, the British reached Lhasa, considered the most secretive city on earth. And above the city rose the mighty and imposing Potala Palace, recently vacated by the Dalai Lama. They had marched nearly 1,200 miles across some of the hardest and highest terrain on earth. The next day, with just a small escort, Younghusband rode into the Tibetan capital. Tibetan civilians watched the entry of the British army and the Chinese officials with complete indifference. Younghusband wrote that they did not seem to care a tuppence damn whether we were there or not. Despite a thorough search of the capital, Younghusband did not find a single Russian spy, nor a single Russian rifle. But of course, that was just part of his remit. The other was to extract commercial and political concessions from the Tibetans. Communications from Lhasa were primitive, to say the least. With no roads or telegraphs, riders had to travel all the way back to India to send a telegram to London. By the time Younghusband had the British government's decision in his hands, 2 weeks had passed. So, effectively, he was left to his own devices when negotiating the treaty. The treaty that the Tibetans signed, called the Convention of Lhasa, gave the British special trading rights in Tibet, installed a British agent in Lhasa, and stated that they could have no relations with another foreign power without British approval. The convention also forced the Tibetans to pay an indemnity of 7.5 million rupees for past border infringements. Payable in instalments, this indemnity would last for 75 years, thus tying Tibet even closer to British India. As part of the treaty, the British occupied the Chumbi Valley, a tongue of land that stretched down into India, as security against the payment of that indemnity. And then, with the convention signed, the expedition headed home. With Tibet firmly within the British sphere of influence and Russia's ambitions halted, Younghusband had won this part of the great game. Or so he thought. It had cost the lives of 200 British Indian troops killed in action, and a further 400 dead from disease and accidents. It had also cost the lives of somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Tibetans killed in battle. In London, Prime Minister Balfour was sensing the winds of change, even if Younghusband and Curzon were not. With their defeat at the hands of the Japanese, the Russians were no longer quite the all-conquering bogeyman the British had been paranoid about for the best part of 100 years. The British also needed the Russians on their side to counterbalance the growing threat posed by Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. So, when the Russians complained about the treaty, London watered it down. And those terms were whittled down even further when the British and Russians signed the Anglo-Russian Agreement in 1907. Younghusband's expedition to Tibet thus proved to be a pointless exercise. It was also the swan song of the diplomatic and military campaigns that had occupied Britain and Russia in Central Asia for almost a century. Despite some Bolshevik agitation in the 1920s and German espionage in Persia and Afghanistan during the First World War, the Tibet expedition was the last throw of the dice in the great game. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story about Britain's war on the roof of the world. Thanks to all my patrons and supporters, and details as to how you can support my work are in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.